Can Agave Utahensis be a houseplant? Right? Like, is it the kind of plant you want to keep indoors? Is it possible to even keep it indoors? The answer, and I'll cut to the chase here for you right now, is yes. But there are some really important things that you're going to need to know about Agave Utahensis and what makes it different than other plants you may think of when you think about a houseplant in order to keep it indoors. But yeah, it absolutely can be a really, really awesome houseplant. And I think it is one of the coolest houseplants. I may be a little biased, but I do think it is a really, really cool houseplant. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Can Agave Utahensis be a houseplant? Spoiler, yes. And when we're keeping Agave Utahensis as a houseplant, what things do we need to think about to make sure that we're giving it the ideal conditions? So to answer the question of whether or not Agave Utahensis will make a good houseplant, we have to ask ourselves first, we have to define our terms, we have to figure out what makes a good houseplant. So I think there are actually basically three components of a plant that determine whether or not it makes a good houseplant. The first one is that it's adaptable to indoor conditions. I mean, can it even live indoors in the first place? The second one is it low maintenance? You don't really want to have an indoor plant that's going to be dropping a whole lot of leaves or that requires super diligent care, because unless you're really, really super into plants, in which case that's probably fun, but that's a whole different thing, I think, than for most people when they're considering just a house plant. So you want something that's low maintenance, that's the second one. And the third is aesthetic appeal, right? If you're gonna have a plant indoors in your house, you're gonna want it to look good and to match your aesthetic and to match the vibes of the room that it's in. So yeah, I do think Agave Utahensis can be a really awesome houseplant, but we have to be careful to understand how it differs from other plants that people consider houseplants. The biggest one, obviously, is that Agave Utahensis is a desert plant. It's essentially a succulent. It's more similar to cactus than it is to a monstera, right? Which is a much more tropical plant that grows in much more humid conditions. And so when we're growing Agave Utahensis indoors as a houseplant, we have to make sure that we're doing our best to provide a similar environment that it would be used to in the wild. So there are four main components of Agave Utahensis' natural environment that we're going to have to strive to replicate to give it its best environment indoors as a houseplant. The first one of those is light, and that's probably honestly going to be the biggest challenge, particularly if you don't have like some indoor-outdoor balcony or porch space, or if you live in a climate that is inhospitable outdoors for much of the year for Agave Utahensis. Although Agave Utahensis is pretty cold hardy, it can actually be sensitive to extreme sun exposure, particularly as a young plant. I know that, for instance, here in Las Vegas, if I stick a seedling out that's a plant under a year-ish old, during the summer it'll melt in just a couple hours. But if you are growing entirely indoors, some sun exposure from a south-facing window or a giant big, super highlight window, or some additional artificial lighting. I talk more about that in my plant care video. The other component, or one of the other components, the second out of the four components, that you're going to need to think about to replicate Agave Utahensis' natural environment to make it work as a houseplant is going to be the soil. Now, Agave Utahensis famously is a calciphyll. I've made a video about that. But what that means is that it grows on calcium-rich soils. Now, you could add some calcium in the form of crushed limestone or crushed eggshells, that sort of thing, to your potting mix. But I think the most important thing here is to match the inorganic to organic content ratio to your specific environment. What that means is I live in Las Vegas, so that means I can put a higher concentration or higher percentage of organic material in my potting soil. Because organic material holds water for longer periods of time, that's good because I live in a dry environment, so otherwise it would just dry out super duper fast. If you live in a more humid environment, you'll probably want to have more inorganic material. That's stuff like pumice, lava, turfus, things like that, because that doesn't generally hold water for as long as organic material does. And so, generally you start at a 50-50 organic to inorganic ratio and then vary that based on your specific environment. But in either case, that medium needs to be really, really well drained because that is what Agave Utahensis is used to in its natural habitat. Now, the next characteristic, the third out of the four characteristics of Agave Utahensis' natural environment that you're going to have to try to replicate when you're growing it indoors is temperature. Now, with many agaves, that would be a little bit trickier than it actually probably is for Agave Utahensis, because many agaves would probably want it to be much warmer than you want it to be, or at least they're used to it being much warmer in their natural environment than you're going to have it in your house. But Agave Utahensis is the most cold hardy agave and lives at 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 feet of elevation, where temperatures never really get that high and are actually pretty cold for much of the year. So indoors, keeping it around the high 60s, low 70s, somewhere in that range is perfectly reasonable. So as a houseplant goes, that particular characteristic, temperature, is not that tricky for Agave Utahensis. And the fourth characteristic, the fourth trait of Agave Utahensis' natural environment that we're gonna have to work to replicate indoors is watering. Right now, Agave Utahensis does grow in the desert, but it is in really well-drained soils. And naturally, when it's not in a container, it's gonna have a really shallow root system that will be able to spread out over a decent area to absorb what water does fall. And it also lives in an environment where in the winter there is decent amount of snow, so that provides some melt in the spring as well, water in the terms of melt in the spring as well. Indoors, I think generally my recommendation here when it comes to watering, as I talked about in my plant care video, is to focus on giving the plant as much water as you can, as often as you can, while ensuring that it dries out in between each watering. Now, if you're like me and you use a whole bunch of fans pointed at your plants, that means you can water really, really frequently. But if you aren't gonna, rearrange your whole living room or have a whole bunch of fans pointed at your plant just to have a cool house plant, like Agave Utahensis, then you might not be able to water quite as frequently as I do. But I would, again, recommend keep an eye on your plant, weigh it so that you can measure how quickly your potting mix dries out, and then water it when it is completely dry. And water it as much as you can while ensuring that it dries out in between each time. So when most people think of houseplants, they're generally thinking of plants that are much more tropical than Agave Utahensis, that are plants that come from much more humid environments than Agave Utahensis does. And so that's one of the big differences between Agave Utahensis and what most folks would consider a traditional houseplant, is that Agave Utahensis is a xeric plant. It's a desert conditioned plant. So you're gonna need to make sure it dries out in between waterings. But what that also means is that for a lot of other folks like me, I have a hard time growing really leafy tropical house plants here in Las Vegas because it's super duper dry. My humidity levels aren't the ideal for those kind of plants. But Agave Utahensis grows very well because it's used to dry conditions. Another thing about most, what people consider traditional house plants is that many of them, compared to Agave Utahensis, can tolerate much less light. Right? They come from tropical environments where there may be shadow from a canopy overhead, or there's some other sort of fern type of plant that doesn't need super duper high bright light. Agave Utahensis, on the other hand, as we've talked about, comes from an environment that is not only a desert, but it is high in elevation. So the UV levels that it gets from in its natural habitat are actually pretty high. And most houseplants, most traditional houseplants that people will have in their house in a container will prefer a much more organic, material-rich potting soil, because that means that the soil will stay wet for longer, because again, these plants like more humid conditions, came from more humid conditions. Versus Agave Utahensis, the potting soil there is going to need to be much more inorganic so that it holds water for shorter periods of time and thus will dry out faster in between watering. So while the temperature consideration for growing Agave Utahensis indoors is not that big of a challenge, as most people are going to have their internal temperature in their house set to some degrees that's perfectly fine for Agave Utahensis. The other three characteristics of its natural habitat that we need to replicate indoors are going to be requirements. They're going to be a little bit more challenging than the temperature one, right? So the first one, and I think this is probably the trickiest, is sunlight, right? How do you give Agave Utahensis enough sun as a house plant, right? The first thing is you try to put it near a window that gets a ton of sun exposure. South-facing windows, the bigger the better, obviously, and with the least shade. You can also think about putting it either outdoors, depending on your climate. You can put it on a balcony if you have one. You can put it in a porch, in a sort of indoor-outdoor space. When doing that, though, be careful to make sure that you're acclimating your Agave Utahensis to the amount of sunlight you're giving it. Especially young plants, Agave Utahensis will burn in really strong direct sunlight if it's not already acclimated to it. And then the other thing that you can do, and I think actually for most folks, this one sounds a little bit intimidating for a houseplant, but is actually fairly easy, is to give it some supplemental or artificial lighting. There's a bunch of, fairly inexpensive LED things on Amazon, lighting systems on Amazon, little clip-on things, little bendy things with multiple lights attached to them on Amazon that'll probably work okay for a single plant. There are, more expensive, but still fairly reasonable LED panels that you could use. But realistically, for most folks, the easiest thing to do is just going to be to find a high power, high lumen LED bulb and use that in a normal socket, and just try to keep that fairly close to the agave plant that you're trying to grow indoors. So the next requirement to grow Agave Utahensis indoors that we need to worry about is water. Now, it's not a challenge because, it's going to be hard to give it enough water. It's going to be a challenge because we really want it to dry out in between waterings. Now, I've talked about in my plant care video how to weigh the plant to see when it's dry, and then that way you know how quickly it dries out and you can know how frequently to water it. But again, my recommendation here is to water as frequently as you can, but make sure it dries out in between waterings. And so we talked about the soil mix, right? And how the percentage of organic to inorganic material is going to vary depending on whether or not you live in a dry desert climate like I do, or you live somewhere more humid. But even if you live here in a dry climate in the desert like I do, you're still going to need a fast draining mix, which still means at least 30-40% inorganic material in your potting soil mix, and fairly large grain material at that, so that it is well draining. Many other sort of traditional houseplants grow pretty fast, especially compared to Agave Utahensis. So that's another thing to keep in mind when growing Agave Utahensis as a houseplant, is that it is a very slow grower. Now that's good because it means that it's fairly low maintenance. It rarely, if ever, needs to be trimmed. If there are dead leaves on it, generally that sort of just adds to the aesthetic of it anyways. And it's not only slow growing, it's also really small, especially for an agave, right? When people think about ornamental agaves, a lot of times they're thinking about these really big landscaping plants. And Agave Utahensis is actually fairly small. It never in habitat as a single plant gets much bigger than maybe a foot across. So that's one thing that does make it really attractive for growing indoors as a houseplant, because it fits in pots basically, and it fits in, it's a reasonable size to put, indoors around living spaces. So yeah, I do think that Agave Utahensis makes a really, really awesome houseplant. It looks super cool. It's definitely adding to the aesthetic of whatever space it's in. It's the right size to do that, right? Because it'll fit comfortably in a living space. It doesn't need this huge outdoors type of space. And it's super duper low maintenance, right? You don't need to be fussing over it. You don't need to be watering it constantly. You don't need to be worrying about the humidity. If you can provide the things that it needs, which are a lot of light, watering only when it's dried out in between waterings, and a really well draining, rocky, gritty soil mix, then it will make an awesome, awesome houseplant. So I'd love to hear from you. Do you keep Agave Utahensis in a container as a houseplant indoors? Do you have it in a greenhouse, on a balcony, on a porch, just outdoors under the full sun? Tell me down in the comments. Thank you.